The subject matter for today is social media research with digital methods. My name is Richard Rogers, Professor of New Media and Digital Culture at the University of Amsterdam. What I would like to do today is talk about a number of techniques to study social media platforms. And these techniques, broadly known as digital methods, are tool-based, but also research question-based. So the examples that I'll give you of the projects that I'm covering will give you a sense of the kinds of research questions that are typically posed in digital methods work, as well as some of the techniques, specific techniques that are used, and some of the outcomes as well. So how productive these methods can be. And in order to situate what we're going to be talking about today, I would like to think of social media as being, or social media research these days, is in a context, a larger context of internet history, and in particular, the context of studying social media as a comment space, as a space of discussion, as a space of debate, as a space mainly of leaving comments in your posts or making different kinds of contributions, whether they're uh, uh, authentic, toxic, sincere, insincere. But generally speaking, to think of social media research as research about the conversations that we are having online. And I want to give you one of the early examples of using techniques to sort of map and study the comment space. And this is the political blogosphere. This is work that was done by Lada Adamek and our colleague to map the liberal and conservative uh, blogospheres in the US and look in particular at their linking patterns. So which blogs link to which other blogs, and you see here a kind of classic story of polarization, where in the red you have conservative blogs largely linking to one another, in the blue the liberal blogs in the US context linking to one another, and some shared linkages, but the story is about the lack of shared linkages between them, between the two spheres. Uh, and when you look to this work more deeply, you'll see that the conversations are quite different, the language is quite different, these, in some sense, realities are quite different. Now, I want to talk about the contemporary study of social media and the various techniques of studying each of these platforms. I'll talk about Twitter, Facebook, Google Web Search, which people don't normally group in social media research, but nevertheless, Instagram, YouTube, and then I'll get a little bit into the deep vernacular web, so Reddit, 4chan, and some alternative tech platforms, Telegram, and then the newcomer TikTok. So I wanted to start off with Twitter and give you a couple of examples right off the start of pieces of work. So this one here is of the URLs that are in tweets by supporters of then candidate Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton in the run-up to the 2016 elections. And you see here again, a similar story to the one that we just showed with the political blogospheres, where you have the Hillary supporters in their tweets linking or referencing particular media sources, and Trump supporters in their tweets referencing particular media sources, and then very few shared sources are referenced. Now, if you look also a little bit more specifically at the sources, you see also on the Trump supporter side the referencing of some quite extreme sources versus on the Hillary side, which is a little bit more mainstream. So when you begin to, so not only is it a story about different referencing, or perhaps people use the term echo chamber, etc., but you can also drill into the types of sources being referenced. The next one is a technique to segment an audience or map a sort of set of, or kind of movement, if you will. This is the alt-right, and these are pictures of those who mention the core members of the alt-right, and so if you mention all 8 of them, you're on the first map, all 7, all 6, or 7 or 6, or now 5, and so you're beginning to show this sort of audience for the alt-right. So here it is again. So there's the core, and then who mentions all 8 of them? There you have it, and then who mentions at least 7, and then who mentions at least 6, and so forth. So this is that's an audience segmentation technique that you can undertake in order to sort of map it like an audience or a group formation, or even to an extent social, sort of a social movement. So those are 2 examples. So one is studying the shared sources of supporters of particular candidates, political candidates. The second one, as I just mentioned, the segmented audiences. You can also look into retweet networks, so who retweets whom. This work is often done to look at, for example, in political research, here it says parliamentarians, so because most parliamentarians in the Western world all have Twitter accounts, and then you can begin to study their own networks and who they retweet and who they don't retweet, and you can then look at diversity, plurality, or again group formation. You can also study hashtag publics. The approach that I oftentimes put forward is to study competing hashtags, and thereby potentially antagonistic hashtag publics. So Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, etc. Just a couple of other ones I'll mention briefly. Single hashtag analysis has often been disparaged in the literature. However, since Me Too, I think it's been making a comeback. But arguably, it's one of the areas where it would work quite well is for summits. So summits normally have political summits or other kinds of, or Olympics, or they normally have a kind of dominant hashtag, which if one were to query and make a tweet collection about that hashtag, one could explore that summit. The tweet collections of public figures, tweet collections of political leaders, populist leaders, all politicians in a particular election, or other kinds of public figures. Oftentimes these days, in particular, there's a lot of work being done on artificial amplification, the extent to which there are bots in a particular space. So if you were to make a tweet collection about a summit or about an election, you could measure the bot activity and see the extent to which this bot activity is artificially amplifying one side versus another. And then, of course, most recently, there's been quite a lot of work on disinformation studies, so-called fake news. And this has been facilitated, in particular in Twitter research, by the availability, or Twitter's making available, particular data sets. The 2 well-known ones are those of the so-called Russian trolls and who they think also is a set of Iranian trolls. And they made these data sets available that you can explore. What's interesting about them is the kind of privacy policy that's built into them, and the ethics thereof. So Twitter has the idea that if of a very specific definition of a public figure, and that is if you have 5,000 or more followers, you're considered as such by Twitter. So in their data sets, they hash or anonymize all users under that figure of followers, and those above they don't hash. So that's interesting to point out. Okay, I'd like to now move over to Facebook. Facebook is the largest of these platforms. It's also, in some ways, the most significant in the sense of what we've been talking about for these sorts of for the disinformation studies, etc. Also have had the reputation recently of being the site of quite a lot of problems around elections in particular. And this is a piece of work here that I think is kind of interesting to point out. It was in the Wall Street Journal. It actually ran for quite a while. They simulated what they called red feeds and blue feeds. So if you were a conservative or like let's say a Trump supporter versus in the previous election a Hillary supporter, or in the more recent election a Biden supporter, the kinds of sources that you likely would encounter in your feed, and then the sort of the kinds of narratives about social issues or about the other that you would be coming across more regularly, and then comparing these is the task at hand. So there's the simulation. Another technique is something we call most engaged with content analysis, and this is a technique where you figure out which posts on Facebook have received the most engagement. And so engagement is likes, shares, comments, or now reactions, shares, comments, and then you add those up. And you see, for example, you take a set of pages of a particular group or group formation. You see here in this example, it's the alt-light, which is the sort of less extremist alternative right, that sort of movement. And we took a number of their pages on Facebook and we looked over a particular period of time. In this case, I think it was a year. And then looked at which posts received the most engagement across all of these pages. So in some sense, you're kind of demarcating a particular group or group formation, and then within that, over a period of time, what animates them. Oh, I should just also mention, before moving on, that the visualization here is a tree map. So the post with the greatest amount of engagement is resized. That is the largest size. And we also placed in this graphic also a sort of subcategorization of different types of posts. So the subcategorization was whether the posts were about white supremacy, whether the posts were about counter-jihadism or Islamophobia, etc. And we in fact found that it was the anti-Muslim posts that animated this group the most. Oh, it should also be pointed out that this work does not explicitly take into account, or can even perhaps take into account, the effects of content moderation. So it could be that posts about white ethno-nationalism were the most engaged with, but that they have been subsequently removed. So the next one is a network graph, network visualization, and here it's a visualization of pages that link to one another. So on Facebook, pages can link to other pages. They can also have related pages, so you could in fact make a network on the basis of Facebook's recommendation algorithm, or make a network on the basis of which page links to which page. And this again is the alt-right. We were doing a lot of work on this at the time, and you see that you can um, link, have a look at the interliked page network, and then by cluster label them, and then see certain subcultures, subcultural movements or sub-movements within a larger space. So you see the alt-right with a bunch of sort of subcultures like vaporwave or others, white pride, etc. So for Facebook, generally, what you see are first the simulations that I showed you. So these are simulations of of news feeds according to, let's say, ideology. The second one is that I showed was the most engaged with content analysis. So you make a list of pages, choose a time frame, and then look across all pages, all posts on all pages to see which ones were engaged with the most, and then that answers the question of what animates a particular group. You can also do inter-liked page analysis. Now, the most engaged with content analysis you can do these days still with FacePager, which connects still to the Facebook Pages API, which for most tools and for many people was discontinued, but that one still continues. Or you can do this work manually. So yeah, so the same goes for inter-liked page analysis. Now, Facebook has rolled out, after basically deprecating the Pages API, rolled out its own tool originally built for marketeers, CrowdTangle. There's also a marketing tool called BuzzSumo that you could repurpose to do most engaged with content analysis. But this type of content analysis or engagement analysis, let's say, is for web URLs on Facebook. So how well do particular web URLs do? So rather than Facebook posts. That's very, very different, but also could be interesting. And finally, Facebook does have an API, a political ads archive API, which one can also look at and do some work with. There are also other projects to archive Facebook. The one in particular that I'm referencing here is a counter-archiving project, but there are a few others where one collects a set of pages on a particular topic, like Russian disinformation pages, which are likely to be taken down, and then one can have that archive keep, so this is also a particular way of trying to do Facebook research in the times of what's referred to as platform lockdown. So the deprecating of platform APIs or other ways in which Facebook in particular, but also Instagram and others, are making it more difficult for researchers to get research data. Okay, I would like to move now to Google Web Search, and in particular talk about a few ways of looking into sort of, let's call them hierarchies of credibility. It's a web epistemological concern. So, which sources of information have the privilege of providing users with it? So with information. So which sources rise to the top and which ones don't for particular queries? That's one, and another one has been of interest recently is about so-called political bias of big tech or Silicon Valley tech, and that's what this particular project looks into here. This is a project where one queries Google, and when you query Google, you have to think about personalization. So for this, we use a research browser, and we also choose the region setting. So this was a project that was about the US, so we chose region US, and also used a US VPN. So this is, and we logged out, etc. So this is all ways in which to kind of disentangle ourselves from the object of study. So personalization and especially geographical personalization, doesn't affect the results. And so this is the results for queries, three queries: guns, firearms is one query. The other one is Second Amendment, and the third one is gun control. And so here you're looking to see what kind of sources are returned for a quote unquote sort of neutral or neutral-ish query versus a conservative query and a liberal in the US sense query. And what we found quite remarkably is for all queries, the top 3-4 results were in themselves quite neutral. And so there were Wikipedia, things like this. And then after that, you had in the returns what you could call sort of left of center or liberal, sort of like from news organizations to NGOs, and then the quite specifically conservative either news sources or other types of sources, conservative ones, were encountered at about result 35. So this is quite, it's kind of quite radical findings, or maybe not so, but it would be, I think, to publish them as I think they would be of great interest to a particular side of that debate these days. The second one that I wanted to talk about is what we refer to as, again, source distance. So how far from the top are particular sources for certain queries. And what you see here is a visualization of what we were studying at the time was problematic information in particular election-related issue spaces online. So if you queried for certain politicians' names and social issues, where in the results were, if anywhere, were so-called problematic sources, and these could be anywhere from sort of extreme sources to conspiracy ones or imposter news organizations, etc. And so you see in the visualization in red is where problematic sources were encountered for particular queries, and so for one or two queries, you can see there was quite a lot, and so and you also get into here like the politics of problematic information, because there was it's in this particular example it's associated in particular with populist leaders and populist parties. So for Google web search, more generally, the techniques that I was referring to concern this quote-unquote source distance research, so how far from the top are either in the first instance sort of conservative versus liberal sources, and in the second instance problematic versus non-problematic sources. But there's also other work that people do, and in particular, they look into the extent to which Google returns in the top. First of all, their own properties, so YouTube videos, Google News, etc. And so this is about Google critique and preferred placement, or even paid placement, things like this, and antitrust concerns. But also people look into the extent to which Google can be or is being manipulated, certainly around particular high-profile events like the Las Vegas shootings, for example, where just after the shooting, a 4chan post was towards the top of the returns in Google, quite infamously. So I'd like to now move on to Instagram. Instagram is a social media platform that in, I think, 2016 it saw its API shut off, and so this was another example of a quote-unquote, or an early example of quote-unquote platform lockdown. Nevertheless, since then, there's been quite some work on building different kinds of scrapers, so you don't get the quantities of data that you got in the past, but you still get some. And this particular example here is again an example of this sort of source distance work. So here, you query Instagram in two ways. You can query hashtags as well as geocoordinates, and the combination is also very interesting. So in this particular case, first, these are hashtag queries. These are queries for again this particular project that we were working on, the politicians. This was for a Dutch ministry. And we queried the hashtags of the politician names as well as certain social issues, and we looked at the extent to which the posts that were returned had sort of divisive content. So were the posts that were returned and also had the highest engagement. So this is then the top. So those with the most engagement are at the top, and then and on down, and then this explores ideas about the extent to which particular type of sort of extreme or problematic content is the ones that are most circulated, most engaged with, or people like to click on, etc. So then the next example is another type of thing that one can do, and these are follower ecologies. So who follows whom? You can make a network out of this, and in this particular case, again, this was a political space, and we found three distinctive clusters: one of a kind of mainstream news cluster, the second one of a kind of mainstream political party cluster, and then the third one is in a kind of emerging sort of right-wing ecology. This concerned a political space, or political Instagram in the Netherlands. And then the third one is something that draws quite a lot of interest, both in like anthropological, but also celebrity studies, and it's the study of fake followers. So, or in the social media company parlance, sort of inauthentic accounts or inauthentic behavior. There was quite a well-known article that was written in the New York Times in 2018 about how celebrities and public figures from all different sectors or walks of life all were discovered to have purchased, or at least somehow acquired, or somehow came upon quite large quantities of quote-unquote fake followers. So one can do this sort of work for a set of public figures. In this particular case, it was a set of media organizations as well as a set of politicians, and to look at the extent to which their follower counts have been artificially inflated. And this is, in some sense, the study of symbolic power. So there are a number of different means by which one can think of the study of symbolic power, but this is how one can appear to be sort of more important than one is, and then one can then use that, of course. This particular one here concerns an interesting analysis put out by Phillips and Milner concerning how over the past few years we've seen the rise of trolling and the rise of insincerity on social media, and we looked into the extent to which the posts around the US elections, 2020 elections, with hashtags related to the candidates at the time. So it was Trump, Biden, as well as Bernie Sanders. What are the top posts, the ones that were getting the most engagement, were sort of insincere, sort of jokey or ironic, or earnest, so sort of well-meaning. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, divisive or non-divisive. And what the particular research project found was, in fact, that most of the content in the political space was, in fact, earnest rather than insincere, even when divisive. So that's what the earnest is in blue, and the earnest and then divisive. Well, these are combinations. You can see it on the legend. So finally, I mentioned at the outset that you can also query Instagram for geo-coordinates. I mean, the combination is interesting. So this particular project, combination of querying geo-coordinates as well as hashtags. Or when querying hashtags, look at the geo-coordinates of the posts. So in this particular project, this was on a project done in 2015 after the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of same-sex marriage. There was the hashtag that circulated right thereafter called Love Wins, and that was met with a counter hashtag or anti-program called Jesus Wins. And so when you look at where these posts were coming from, you could map in some sense a kind of geography of hate, if you will. So in sum, we looked at, again, this sort of source distance exercise, and then in this particular case with most engaged with content, so how high up are particular types of content when they're engaged with the most, and characterize that kind of content. We looked into briefly follower ecology, so who follows whom on Instagram, the study of fake followers. There are a variety of tools and techniques for this, for fake follower studies. There's also the idea that content, that insincere content might circulate more than sincere, or that divisive content might circulate more than non-divisive, or that particular spaces are dominated by those kinds of types. And finally, geolocating hashtag publics, and the idea of being able to kind of show a geography of a particular side taking on a social issue. I mean, you can call it sort of hashtag publics or an antagonistic hashtag publics analysis. So I want to now touch on YouTube. YouTube for years has been quite generous in its data provision through its API, and when looking at the YouTube API, there are a few things that you can do that stand out, or just when looking at the interface. So you can search YouTube and analyze the sort of hierarchies in the results in similar ways that you could study Google Web Search, for example. And this is what you see here. This is a rank flow diagram, a consistent query over a period of time. This is, in fact, the Syrian war, I think it was the query. And then which videos are returned per day. And what's interesting about this particular piece of work, this is published as a work by Bernard Rieder and colleagues, is that you see that on particular days when a certain event in the Syrian war takes place, the videos at the top of the search returns are actually a bit more extreme. And you could possibly, this is what one oftentimes refers to as the sort of excitability of YouTube's algorithms. So you can study search engine returns. So also on YouTube, you can create subscription networks. So channels can subscribe to other channels, and you can see which channels subscribe to which ones and create a network from it. Also, channels can feature other channels. So in this particular work, this was again on the alt-right, and looking at the extent to which it's a kind of on YouTube. So these are kind of alt-right. These are sort of like internet personalities, YouTubers, let's say, and seeing the extent to which they're kind of well interlinked, at least through subscribing to one another or not. In fact, they're not so well. And then who features whom. And so when we looked into this further, what we found is that the feature networks actually show quite well business relationships. So this is again, so you can make larger networks of subscribers. I mean, this particular one here, these are related channel networks. That was a particular feature that was in the API, and then it wasn't in the API, and then it returned, and then it disappeared again. But nevertheless, it gives you a sense of the, the kind of networks you can get. So just like in Facebook, you can map, sort of the networks of the users. So in this case, the channels, or you can sort of create a network with the recommendations of the platform. So it's like which channels are related to one another according to YouTube. There's one other thing that I just wanted to show, which I think is kind of interesting. So recently, a lot of the platforms, YouTube certainly, have been deleting quite a lot of content. This is called deplatforming, or there are other terms as well. And the question is, well, what's being removed, and what are the implications of that for basically the study of public discourse, debate, censorship, cancel culture, etc. So in this particular case, researchers using 4chan, which we'll come to in a second, made a list of YouTube URLs, quite extreme content, and then looked over time whether or not they're still available. And so on one date, you see you see some content. On the next day, that's there, you see that they've been deleted. And so then you can begin to look into the type of content that's been deleted, the type that's been left up. You can look into any sort of traces of, whether this deletion was sort of automated, whether it was all done exactly at the same time, and things like this. So you basically begin to probe the larger issue of, let's call it the politics of deletion. So for YouTube, you can study a number of things with the API. I mean, I started off with search, and I also talked about making networks. So channel subscription networks, so which channels subscribe to which, and which channels feature other channels. Also talked about content removal. But one of the other things that is of interest, and you can also do with some top software developed digital methods, is look into the sort of recommendation algorithm, and in particular what you could call the carousel or the up next. And there have been a lot of sort of research into this, journalistic as well as some big data work on the extent to which the algorithm is designed to keep you watching, to binge watch, and that's done through providing more and more extreme videos. And so you could, in fact, look into that. And you could also do that comparatively. Compare a number of different spaces. So you can start with one video that's like a news broadcast where experts appear, and another one with sort of YouTubers, internet celebrities, more extreme figures, and then compare the recommendations to those videos one after the other, and to see whether they both end up in extreme spaces or only one does. I want to now talk about Reddit and move now into the deep vernacular web, term that was coined in Amsterdam at the Open Intelligence Lab. And this is a term that refers to sort of spaces where the users are not public facing, but rather are anonymous, and where there are, in some ways, a kind of different sorts of subcultures. Now Reddit for one was known for a while as having um, quite sort of extreme subcultures. I mean, it also has very sort of quite political stuff, but also very innocuous stuff. So these are all subreddits. So the major one that was being studied quite a lot, especially during the Trump period, was the subreddit called the Donald. It was also the largest. It was thought to be the site for what was referred to as meme magic, and sort of memeing Trump into the presidency. And so all of Reddit is archived, and you can query that archive. It's a push shift archive, and we also have created tools ourselves that build on top of that. So one can look at, for example, and this is what you see before you, a number of subreddits in a particular language space. So so this is then Dutch Reddit, and then all of the subreddits there, and then those that have problematic information. So one can sort of basically study per subreddit the language used, or the activity, etc. But one can also study sort of like national Reddits, if you will. So that's so there's single subreddit analysis, and this also one can study the sort of traveling of ideas from one particular part of the deep vernacular web, for example, from 4chan to Reddit, and then off to sort of Facebook or Twitter, etc. This is the sort of what is referred to by the Open Intelligence Lab as the sort of normification approach. Now, 4chan is quite notorious. It's the site of quite extreme content, but it's also the site of has very specific subculture, kind of trolling, kind of jokey, sort of edgy. Also, a lot of bad language, etc. Especially on its most or its biggest board poll. So, like with Reddit, studying subreddits, here you can study individual boards. So we've archived a few of these, and the outputs of these can be, for example, these are image boards, so the outputs can be image walls, so which kinds of images are being circulated at particular points in time, and you can use software like image sorter, image plot to make image walls, and then group the images according to formal properties, or show them over time to see the changes in that particular space. Word of warning: a lot of the imagery is quite offensive. Although you're also, this is also the place where a lot of sort of edgy and leading edge memes are being developed and circulated. A lot of them are racist, anti-Semitic, etc. So this is something also to look at. But as with Reddit, you can study individual boards, or you can do cross-board studies, or you can begin to think of 4chan as having sort of national spaces. So whilst users are anonymous, they oftentimes will use country flags, so you can group posts by country flag and explore, for example, the sort of extremeness or innocuousness of Reddit in a particular country or a particular language space. I also wanted to show you this is the ephemerality of posts, or general posts in particular on Reddit. So after a number of contributions per, let's call it, thread, it automatically gets deleted. However, the discussion oftentimes continues, and this is a way of thinking about studying 4chan is in some ways what you could think of as the sort of continuity despite ephemerality. So what continues there despite the continual deletion of these threads. So as I said, single or multiple boards, or you can delineate a national space, and then you can also study these threads. Telegram recently, well, a few years ago, was associated with ISIS content, and one of the reasons is it has a reputation for being really highly secure and anonymous, and a very, let's call it, liberal content moderation policy. Since then, it's cracked down on that kind of material, but a lot of the extremists or extreme internet celebrities who were deplatformed from mainstream platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, have fled, so to speak, or migrated to Telegram and to an alternative tech ecology that includes Telegram. On Telegram, what you can do is you can form a group, or you can set up a account where other people can subscribe to you and in some ways follow you. So this is how a lot of the sort of extreme internet celebrities have been using Telegram. And what we did when we looked into a number of them, I think we took about 20 of these folks who were deplatformed from the mainstream platforms, and then we looked at their content and what they were linking to, and in particular which other platforms they were linking to. So this is a link analysis of a set of extreme internet celebrities, and what we found in particular was that there are certain platforms that they still link to that they've been thrown off of, like Twitter and YouTube. So, but then others that they've also been thrown off of, they hardly link to at all, like Facebook and Instagram. And so what we found is that Facebook and Instagram well, first of all, we found that we could do cross-platform analysis by just looking at this single platform, but also that there are some platforms are still relevant to them despite being deplatformed, whereas others are not relevant. This was in some ways a partial answer to the question of for whom does deplatforming work? And it seemed to work for Facebook and Instagram in the sense that they are no longer of interest to these extreme internet celebrities. What's also interesting here is that the one space that is being kind of rejuvenated by them in some sense through links is the web. So social media, of course, has followed the web. A lot of portions of the web are far less healthy these days because many have fled the web to social media. But kind of ironically, if you will, the web gets a bit of a comeback here from these extreme internet celebrities. Um, Another thing that is of interest is to look at this larger alt tech ecology. So um, this, well, when looking and then looking at sort of Telegram's place in it, but also other alt tech platforms' place in it. So we took all of these extreme internet celebrities. And we looked at which platforms they still are a part of, where they still have accounts, and then also the alternative ones where they have the new accounts, and made this kind of map of and did find indeed that Telegram is quite central, although not as central as it was, I just mentioned, as their own personal websites making a comeback, but also some of the other alternatives like BitChute, the alternative to YouTube. So with Telegram, uh, we study the public channels, so the channels that are used to try to get a follower base or a fan base. You can also study public groups, and you can study the place of one of these alternative platforms, so in this case Telegram, in a larger alt-tech ecology. I want to now conclude with TikTok. So TikTok is interesting because it is not only, I mean, one can study, the youth culture, the sort of and the trends of creative expression on this medium, but also it's also increasingly a political space. So just in the run-up to the 2020 U.S. presidential elections, TikTok posted this notice saying that it wouldn't stand for inauthentic or extreme content, and it also asked others not to post it. And what we then did is we looked into a number of political hashtags around the three candidates at the time. So Trump, Biden, and Sanders, the ones that were still left around, I think it was Super Tuesday, somewhere at the end of March or early April 2020, and also specific political hashtags. So this MAGA one, and then looked into the kinds of creative expression. So so on TikTok, there are certain trends, like there'll be a certain noise or audio clip that will suddenly become trendy and everyone will use, and they also signify certain things. So there's one which is used to call something into question. So what we found is that a lot of the special effects being used in the political space were to call into question mainstream media accounts of certain things. So it becomes a kind of misinformation space in a different way than one normally thinks of misinformation as sources or stories. This just sows doubt. We also looked into, this is using a TikTok scraper. We were scraping the most engaged with videos per candidate query, as well as some other hashtags. What was interesting, incidentally, is that hashtags don't demarcate political spaces as you might think they would. So both videos that you could say on the left and on the right use all the political hashtags at the same time. So hashtags are used for audience generation as opposed to for, let's call it, identity politics. So in this particular case, we then looked into the extent to which sort of problematic videos were amongst the most engaged with content on, let's call it, political TikTok. So for TikTok, one can study again forms of creative expression, and then within particular hashtag spaces. And what we were looking at, in fact, was in some sense um, hashtag public, so those using, but that term I think does not really work so well in TikTok. Um, but nevertheless, you could think of it that way because they're not all hashtag use is multi hashtag per video, and you could certainly see how um, sets of videos were or on one side of political spectrum and on the other side of the political spectrum. You can also look into top content. So again, this is a kind of source distance. So how far from the top is what have you. So in this particular case, we looked into misinformation. We also discovered, incidentally, that TikTok, with its sarcasm, especially the use of audio, so certain kinds of sounds to be sarcastic, that was the way in which mistrust or even misinformation was sown through satirical sound. So, what I've done is introduce to you the study of different kinds of techniques per platform to study the comment space or social media more generally, and in particular looking into certain approaches that are quite dominant, or techniques that are quite dominant when you, in some ways, follow the fields available to you in the APIs or the dominant features of particular platforms, and then unpack those. So studying recommendations. So that's on the, let's say, on the algorithmic side, or engagement, that's on the user side. So thank you very much.